Welcome to Compass, Finding Spirituality in the Everyday. My name is Ryan Dunn. Today we're joined by Tamice Spencer-Helms, a thinker and innovator in the realm of spirituality and faith. This episode is all about spiritual mixtaping, which is pulling together the intricate tapestry of faith, culture, and personal identity. Tamice shares with us their unique metaphor of the rest mixtape, which is a fusion of radical, ethical, spiritual, and tethered practices that serve as a guide for navigating our increasingly complex world. Tamice also takes us back to the historical roots of hush harbors, which offer fresh insights on creating safe, inclusive spaces in today's communities of faith. Tamice Spencer-Helms is a theologian, public speaker, curriculum developer, and consultant with over 2 decades of experience in young adult leadership, spiritual innovation, and social change. And Tamice brings a deep well of wisdom to their work. So join us as we uncover how embracing human complexity, re-examining traditional narratives, and stitching together the valuable parts of the past can lead to a richer, more holistic spiritual life. Whether you're questioning faith, exploring spiritual intersections, or seeking a contemporary lens through which to view ancient wisdom, this episode of Compass is guiding you towards a spiritual grounding and growth. Let's go.
Tamice, we're so glad to have you on the Compass podcast. How goes it with your soul today?
My soul is well. It is looking back and remembering right now. So
all right. Well, we're going to get into all of that. We're going to talk about things like hush harbors and rest, and both rest and the acronym rest, and mixtapes, which for me is something looking back or nostalgic. As being a Gen Xer, mixtapes were a big part of at least my formative years. It's a way that my friends and I communicated with each other. Whenever I was putting together a mixtape, I was thinking about sharing these with other people. Yes. So with that in mind, before we even get into the metaphor that you're using mixtapes for now in the current context, like what would be on your mixtape? If we're sharing something of yourself with our audience, what are you putting on it for them?
Okay, so there's always going to be some Lauryn Hill.
All
Probably
right.
from Miseducation. There'll be a couple of tracks from that. There will always be Kendrick. There will always be something from Frankie Beverly. Because it just really connects me to my family and my parents and kind of cookout culture.
Okay, yeah.
So it'll be a little bit of feel good, a little bit of angst, a little bit of God, a little bit of truth telling, all wrapped up in one. So I think that's will be on it, but definitely X Factor from Miseducation is going to be on there.
Okay, right on. Well, bringing it forward to today, you're working in kind of an online program, online community called Rest Mixtape. Rest is an acronym, then Mixtape. Talk to us a little bit about the mixtape aspect. Like, why is that kind of the organizing metaphor or the ideal that you're bringing into this community?
It's a really good question. I think, I think part of what I experienced in sort of my upbringing in Western faith constructs was a real sense of outsourced intuition. And so when I was seeking to kind of recover that and recover my own intuition, recover agency when it came to faith and the ways that I was naming divine reality, the mixtape just popped up because it's such an intuitive curation. I don't ask questions when I'm creating a mixtape, whether or not the selections are good, whether or not people should hear this song. I think they should. There's a real cool thing when you're curating something like a mixtape that kind of helps you to kind of bypass the typical self-doubt. And I think using a mixtape as a methodology for what we do about an increasingly post-Christian world is a helpful way for people to not feel so daunted by the task of figuring out what we do now, or intimidated by that task, but really thinking about how do we mixtape the best things, the things that we want to keep, the things that we want to remember, the things that we want to bring in. How do we curate that from our wisdom traditions and from the things that move us? And so I don't know, it just felt like when I was working on my doctorate, I had come up with sort of what I've started calling these like sort of beautiful boundary lines that have fallen to me in pleasant places. And that kind of came of this acronym that was also kind of manifesting in my life as rest. And so it kind of was like, well, how did I get here? The way I got here was a sort of a mixtape methodology. And so I just started to kind of talk about it as the rest mixtape.
Tell me a little bit about what you mean by outsourced intuition, because I feel like a lot of us feel that in spaces of faith. So I'd love for you to put some flesh onto that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real well, when someone's intuition is outsourced, you can get them to do a lot. Because they don't have a reference point for truth that is within themselves. And so I think that really probably the most, I don't want to say controversial. I mean, I hope it's not controversial. I think it's Evangelion, but I hope it's not controversial. But one of the things that I am troubling with the mixtape is the notion of depravity, because the notion of depravity is what leads someone to outsource their knowing. And I think that that's what's happening in the origin stories that kind of set the stage for the rest of Christianity. And so I feel like we have to go back there, right? To go back to the garden and figure out what is really being asked here and what is really happening in this story. I know that for me, particularly, Genesis 3 was used to identify my sin nature, that this was the fall of sin and that my nature was sinful and it's because of what happened in this garden. But, you know, in my excavation process, I go back and look and sin is nowhere in the garden. Sin doesn't come until Cain and Abel. So something else is happening here. And that's what started to make me think about what are the questions being asked? What are the answers and the actions that are happening in this story? And what else might we see here that could help us? Because I've looked at sort of the fruit of what people believing in their own depravity does. And it really causes people to act depraved, right?
Yeah.
Like there's no, you don't have an option. You know, it's an identity that has been conferred onto you. And you have no choice about that. And so that's troubling, I think, for people. And so how do you navigate the world when yourself is not trustworthy? You have to outsource. But then that means that you're being led by something. And what the rest of mixtape does is say, what is the something? And do you want that to be leading you?
Yeah. Okay. And the idea of depravity is simply this idea that like human beings at our core, we're just like dirty, sinful beings. Okay.
Right. And I think one of the things that I think makes the mixtape process so cool is that I grounded in Black cultural creativity as a sacred text, because you're dealing with a lived experience of people who had an identity conferred onto them, who confounded everybody who conferred that identity onto them. I mean, to be in abjection, to be told that you are not human, to be told that you are an animal, and to create the Black church and music and art and poetry and families and food and culture, that is confounding to the logic. And I think that what we need right now is to learn from people who have like kind of worked this technology of confounding that kind of a logic, because there had to be a resistance to a messaging about a sense of self that was wretched, right, in order for Black people to do anything in this country. And so I think, you know, I get the permission, right? I get the permission to trouble these texts from people who proved the interpretation of those texts incorrect.
Do you think with a mixtape mindset, that in a way we're able, I don't know if it's fair to say that we're able to redeem some voices from the past, but we're able to like lift out the valuable while still recognizing the negative? Because I got to admit, like, you know, there are a lot of people that had some ideas that I might find valuable today, but also said some repulsive or heinous things.
Right. And I think that's the best way, right? Like, I think, you know, with my lived experience of a person who is constantly feeling like I'm living on the edge of institutions because of just who I am as a person, it's a really interesting thing to think about. Like, even that impulse, the either or impulse, the binary impulse is not natural to me. What's natural to me is to think about what can work. Is there a third way? What can we keep? You know, sometimes people are amazing and also jerks in the same day, and so we
Truth.
need ethical framing, and religious containers that hold space for human complexity. But when you're either good or bad, either saved or lost, you really don't give room for people to think about their own human complexity. And so then you don't give people the opportunity to change. And that creates shame, right? Like, and I think about how this plays out, not just in like Christian circles, but in cancel culture, right? Like what is the nature of perfection? Which again takes us back to that garden scene. What do you even mean by perfect? What does God mean when God says, be perfect as I am perfect? We need to re-ask these questions using a logic that doesn't come from binary thinking, because we all see that nothing is this or that. A lot of times things are both and, or yes and, or no, not yet, and that's life. And so we need constructs that make sense of life, which is what the E in the Rest mixtape does. The ethical relationality there tries to think about ethics that are based in sort of a non-duality, a sense of like life is complicated and liminal. And so our ethical choices need to take that into account. And what that does is it makes it so that people believe other people can change, right? You live in the world with an orientation that people are not depraved. And most people, if given the right opportunities and given the right information, are willing to change. And I've been testing this in my travels. And when I've been in scenarios with people that I would typically not talk to, I will test this, and it works.
Okay. The idea of perfection is scintillating to me, just because maybe I have some perfectionist tendencies. Like I always want things to be just right. And in fact, a lot of times I'll keep myself from doing things because, my anticipated outcome is not going to be that of perfection. So for people like me, how are you thinking about perfection these days?
Oh man, I'm thinking about perfection as a process.
Yeah.
And so that automatically takes a lot of pressure off. And so when we think about perfection in scripture, Matthew 5:48, be perfect as I am perfect. Some other people, I think Peter might render it, be holy as I am holy. We've got to ask, what does God mean by holy? So we would hear the question, we would hear the response. Holy means different, set apart, unlike what you see. Okay, so what do you see about Jesus that makes him different from the people he sees? He's present to the moment. He goes with the flow. He's there. Raw, incarnate presence. Fully there. Fully there. I mean present, not dissociated. Here. Presence and perfection are one and the same to me. To be fully present, flaws and all, but willing to change is perfect. I need to be on the edge of becoming. That's what perfection is. It's an acknowledgement that I'm fully here and I'm okay right here, and also there is more, and I'm open to that. It's a way to stand and live in the world that makes you different from folks who are buying into the logic of caste and empire, who are believing this logic, most of those people are angry. They kind of feel like, I keep picturing that woman in the scriptures who's like bent over for all those years, right? That kind of a logic and that kind of a framing of perfection leads to despondency. And it's odd to me that as we think about our social landscape right now, like the despondency and the despair from people who say they've been perfected in God. How does that work? So again, it's not to throw the things out. It's to re-examine them. This word is living. This word was said to be living. So that means it moves, it grows, it breathes. And I think that we just need, what the Rest mixtape is a container for the living word to go with us into these new frontiers of faith. And, you and I talk a lot about technology and, all of that kind of stuff. So that's what I do.
Yeah. I feel like we're ready to talk about rest, and not just rest in terms of like Sabbath or taking it easy for a little bit, but the acronym that you've lifted up as part of your practice. Can you give us what that acronym stands for and a little bit about those principles?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah, so the REST, rest, it stands for radical, ethical spirituality that is tethered. And what I mean by radical there is naming what's real, telling the truth. For someone who was given a vision of a Christ who held no space for my lived experience, there wasn't a lot of truth telling in the foundation of my faith. And so it disappointed me. So I put that back into the way I do my faith. It has to tell the truth. Tell the truth about the world I'm really living in, right? And tell the truth about who I really am. Like, hey, there's some ways I need to come up in this area, right? So we got to start with truth telling. It can't just be the truth about out there. And also needs to be about what am I contributing to what's out there, right? From there, we go to ethical, right? So radical ethics is about non-duality that, I've this came by way of the East, right? And by way of ancestral understandings of Ubuntu and utter non-separateness that comes from people like, that comes from like Advaita Vedanta and people like Roman Panikar, who talks about cosmotheandric spirituality, this reality that all things are one. And I get the permission to add this from Christian scriptures. In 1 Corinthians 15, it's 28, Paul is laying out. So we would say that, Christians believe the thing that makes you a Christian is what you believe about resurrection, right? You believe that Christ is risen from the dead. And so resurrection is a key component of any kind of conversations we have about Christianity. So let's have them, right? And so in the chapter about resurrection, you have Paul in verse 28, who says, and then comes the end. He paints this picture of these kingdoms being sort of submitted and surrendered to the Father. And then it says, and the last enemy to be defeated is death. Once that enemy is defeated, the Son is made submissive to the Father. And then the kingdom is made submissive to the Father. And God is all in all. What Paul is describing here is some sort of enfolding and coming back into oneness that I only see reflected in Eastern traditions. I've never heard anybody from Christianity talk about this passage. But if the last enemy to be defeated in 1 Corinthians 28 is death, that means that the end of Christianity is not heaven. Revelation ends with death, right? Paul is going, the end of Christianity is not actually heaven. It's this it's 1 Corinthians 15, it's God is all in all. That's where this thing is actually going. God is all in all. Now that puts us in a different starting point for thinking about how we share about our faith, how we communicate our faith, how defensive we are about our faith. If that's where it's going, why don't Christians start there and work backwards? We don't have to abdicate Jesus. We don't have to abdicate anything. What we do let go of is supremacy, exclusivism, which is colonial, not Christian, right? So that's the ethics. The spirituality piece is sacred smallness, right? This idea that like small in a good way. Like I've been made to feel small in religious spaces, not that kind of small.
Yeah.
I mean small in a good way. And the only way I could describe it was when we were in San Francisco. And I told you about it when we were at the Presidio, that I walked up to this tree and it literally took my breath away. And the reality of it was it was unmediated. It was uncontrollable. And I'm like, oh, that was worship. That the beauty and the majesty and the ancient nature of this tree, the fact that it is still here, that it has seen thousands of years of history. It is here and it is standing and it is vast. And I looked at that and I was like, oh, this is what they meant. This is what they mean by awe and wonder and worship. It pulled it out of me. It wasn't everybody lift your hands now. We're going to worship. Lift your hands to the Lord. It wasn't compulsory. It wasn't give him what you got because you owe him, or, he's worthy of it. Give him the glory because you better. It was like, whoa, what is that? That is beautiful. You can't do anything but fall face down. Now, anybody that I've seen encounter God in scripture has that reaction, typically. And so it was like, oh, this is what is meant by spirituality. Now, what I call it is the T. What I call it is tradition. The tradition is the language that we get that connect us to place and ancestry and story of survival and resistance. language is important. On the one hand, when you think about spirituality, it can coexist, right? Like if God is all in all, then everything is language. It's just what you call it. And on the other hand, traditionally, it matters what you call it because it connects you to a people and a place. And that can be very anchoring. So in between the radical truth telling and the tethering to wisdom and place and tradition is this ethical spirituality that gets to get worked out because times change. And we change. And that's kind of it in a nutshell. And like the mixtape portion, again, is me bringing in film and scripture and stories to kind of demonstrate ways of doing this. Ways we can trouble some of the logic we've inherited, and then some paths forward as well, examples of how people are walking this out. That's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. When you're talking about troubling some of the things that we've inherited, as you've started this program, you're working with some people on almost on like a coaching or mentoring relationship. What are some of the issues that you run up against consistently? What needs troubling?
I think, honestly, Ryan, what's troubling is the fear of embracing other ways of knowing and being. So I think for me, as someone who's pastoral, I am trying to think of ways to get people across that threshold of invulnerability and fear. Because that threshold in and of itself is the threshold to God. And so I think for me, working with young people, it really is about how do I not repeat what happened to me in terms of like feeling like was forced to believe to belong. How do I not repeat what happened to me in other ways, which was like what I did believe was seen as stupid or archaic or silly. The best way I've found doing it has been the music. So what we do is we'll do circles and everybody will submit a playlist and, I'll have a prompt. So the most recent one we did, I had a prompt and the prompt was, put a song in the playlist that sums you up. And they did. And, we played them and people had to guess, whose song was what. So then the person would reveal themselves and talk about why and how. And then we would talk about, we borrow from Dory Baker's Live to Tell model. And so then we would kind of do that storytelling. It's a little bit different, but it borrows from that. And then they would start to talk about what this song means and where it comes from. And then, as the pastor, I do the part of like, where do you see something radical here? Where do you see something ethical here? What from your tradition does this remind you of? What does this what does this have to say about God and the Spirit? And in that way, they're having spiritual conversations that feel tethered because it's their music. They pick the track, right? And it's a really beautiful way to not only excavate like how are people naming God right now? Because me with more experience and degrees, I go, oh, that's epistemological frameworks, or that's that's soteriology.
And they're like, yes, of course. And
I can translate it back. I will never force the language on them. Because that's not how it works. Language has to be conjured if God wants to be remembered. And so I really think that that's a good way to get around that is like, how do we identify, right? When we're talking to young people, our job is not to make them say what we want them to say. Our job is to find out how what they're saying is what we want them to say, right? Our job is to do the translation work. Our job as shepherds is to think about how do we lead to green pasture? How do we make lie down? Not how do we make confess certain doctrinal truths. And I think my work at Subculture was a response to that because it was like working in campus ministry was all about counting conversions. But my students, I wanted more than that for them. I wanted them to self-actualize. I wanted them to name God, like give God a name, like Hagar, that's going to be important for you. Is it just the God of my campus minister? Or is it the God who sees me? That's going to change how you live your day to day, whether you gave God the name or somebody else did, So I think, thinking about young people in that regard and letting them name God, it's okay. If God is all in all, there is no name that's wrong. And we see that trajectory from Genesis 11 to Acts 2, right? DEI is a divine agenda, not a left one. Okay.
When folks are joining into the Rest mixtape, do they have Are they able to name for themselves like a desired outcome? Are they joining for a specific reason?
Yeah. So the people who join the mixtape right now are subculture fellows, because we're piloting it.
Yeah.
But yeah, for the most part, they joined the fellows because they wanted robust support as they try to navigate college. And so what the fellows program does is they get a savings account, they get a monthly living expense stipend, they get a well of wisdom, which is a person that is in their 60s or so that they track with. They get a success coach, but then they also get access to like going through the mixtape every week. So we do weekly like gatherings, we do retreats together, learning journeys. So they're signing up for that. And I think, what I love about Subculture's programming is that it thinks about self-actualization. It inverts the pyramid, and it says, well, if we prioritize that, what are the things we need to build so that they can actually sit in a room and think about who is God to me, and how do I walk out a radical ethical spirituality that's still tethered to my tradition so I don't feel lost out here in the waves. I mean, 2025 is wild. They're going to need anchoring, and I think what I'm offering comes from a perspective of somebody who had to create an anchor, because I think there are people who are finished, who are, spiritual and not religious, but a lot of times those people haven't done the real radical truth-telling part. So they haven't excavated the colonial impulse to just abandon tradition. That's actually what colonization is. It is an abandonment of tradition, to just take, and leave things in the wake. That's not what people of color do. We keep things to remember that remind us of place. And so to be spiritual and not religious can sometimes be very ambient and ethereal and like not anchored. But if it's not anchored, it really can't lead well. And we're in times right now, we need people who can lead us, who are anchored somewhere. I think that's just important to say. This is not a time to not say that, Yeah. It needs to be said.
Are people coming because, are they coming from a traditional Christian background and they're looking for something different, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the folks that went through the focus group, and that was all practitioners. So practitioners, from the new evangelicals to like people doing church work in rural America, to people who are, to Starlet, who's doing raceless gospel, right? We've got people who are doing trips. My sister-in-law, Alyssa Ann Travels, is doing trips. I mean, there was a bunch of different types of perspectives on this call because I wanted to know, like, how does this sound? How is this landing? Those folks were coming in with Christian leadership perspective, I would say, right? So the conversation in that class is different than the conversation I have with my Black students. My Black students, I'm not going to trouble much because it's not helpful. That's going to be dysregulating for them. What I'm going to do is just ask them some questions, like questions essentially like Jesus asked, which is, what do the scriptures say? How do you read them? And then we go from there, right? And so for them, it's not so much about them not be wanting to get rid of their Christianity. For people of color, like, especially Black people in America, Christianity is a survival mechanism. It's a harder thing to let go of because so much identity formation took place in the Black church and affirmation took place in the Black church. Yes, wounding, but it's a more complicated conversation. And so I wouldn't have that conversation in that context like I would with like leaders and practitioners who are thinking about the future of faith, right? So it just depends on who's gathered, like how deeply we go into each of the elements.
Okay. In speaking with you, through our many conversations, something that you consistently bring up to me is the idea of hush harbors.
Yes.
Can you talk to us a little bit about that, and specifically like the place of hush harbors in today's society, and like how communities of faith can start to live into that kind of safe environment?
Yes. I'm feeling so much deep gratitude for the ancient Black spiritual technology of the hush harbor. I think that technology can be mapped onto other things. I'm trying to do an app right now that is like actually encoding a hush harbor. But I think deeply about what is the nerve that drove these people to carve out a clearing In the midst of all of that literal darkness, I mean, they would, when you think about what this thing was, it's profound. These people from all of these different tribes in Africa who had been trafficked, sold a lie, trafficked, put on boats with people they didn't know, who didn't speak their language. I mean, locked up together with people you never met before. That would be like somebody coming to your house and throwing you into a van with a neighbor you've never talked to who speaks a different language, and made 15 of y'all get into a sedan. Okay? So that's what I want you to feel. So these people are brought together in trauma and trafficking. And they come to this land. They don't know the land. The people who do know the land have been pushed out of it. And they come here. They're forced to work, ripped from their families, violently treated, dehumanized, and somehow they follow what Ifa calls the feeling. You know, we could call it the spirit. Everybody calls it something different. They follow this impulse to get free. It's an impulse. It's an orientation to life. It's an impulse towards freedom. And so what they did, the way that it manifested was they would sneak out in the middle of the night, and you just had to know where to go. You had to follow the feeling. And they would come upon this a lot of times it was like a marsh area where it would be wooded and swampy and dark. And they would go out there and they would chant in their language. They would dance. They would hum and sing. They would prophesy. They would preach. In Toni Morrison's book, Beloved, Baby Suggs Holy, she says, love your hands, lift them up. She is declaring you are good. You are not depraved. And in that space of fugitivity, they carved out a name for God. They carved out a culture. Out of all of these different tribes came Black culture, out of this spiritual fugitivity. Now, the Hush Harbor started first. After that, as they get more and more proximity to learning the Bible, like they learn to read by reading the Bible and things like that. So of course, now you begin to institutionalize, right? And so the Hush Harbor, though, it needs to be said, is the foundation for the Black church. And that matters for people like me with queer identity, because the Black church is not always welcoming to people like me. So I needed a deeper root that let me keep the Black spiritual technology that has all my grandparents' stories connected to it and all my ancestors' stories connected to it, but didn't require me to show up in fractions. And so the Hush Harbor can be a really beautiful technology, I think, for today as we think about fugitivity and carving out a clearing where we can be free. The Spirit of God is an orientation to freedom. It is an orientation to life. That is why the message of God is resurrection. You can't kill life. And that is a witness that takes place in every sphere, whether it is a dying star, to a tree, to the skin when we get a cut. Resurrection is a fact of life. Jesus embodies that as a first century Jewish rabbi, but it's not unique to him. It's everywhere. What does Romans 1 say? What can be known about God is seen in the cosmos and in nature. So the story of resurrection is a fact. That's what gives us courage. That's what gives Jesus courage to be nonviolent. You can't kill life.
Right on. Well, we're coming to the close of our time, Tamice, but for people who want to learn more about either who you are or some of the programs that you're involved in, where's a good spot to catch up with you?
You can find me at TamiceSpeaks.com. That's like, cool. I think the distillery, I guess. I'm showing up in a couple of different ways, and you can find them all in that space.
Awesome. Well, Tamice, thank you so much for sharing your program with us, your ideas, and for the invitation to show up in some spaces without that sense of fractionalization. Like, that's going to stick with me for a little bit.
And I meant to tell you this. There's a course just went live on my site. And it's called the Faith Unleavened Seminar, and we'll start on March the 6th. And it's a class. It's a real class to kind of do this gently and to do it well with people who are wanting to do it in a safe environment with someone who has figured out an anchor.
Well, that brings us to the end of another enlightening episode of Compass, Finding Spirituality in the Everyday. A big thank you again to our guest Tamice Spencer-Helms for sharing their insights on the Rest mixtape and the transformative power of spiritual technology. And for our listeners, if you want to dive deeper into today's conversation or explore more episodes, be sure to visit our website at umc.org/compass. There you'll find episode notes and just a treasure trove of meaningful discussions to guide your spiritual journey. We're grateful to the dedicated team at United Methodist Communications for making this podcast possible, and we appreciate all their hard work behind the scenes. Before we go, we'd like to invite you to subscribe to our podcast if you haven't already. It's a great way to stay connected and to ensure that you don't miss any of our future episodes. Also, if you could take a moment to rate and review us, it would really help us to reach more people with Compass. So thank you for spending this time with us today. Until next time, journey well and find the sacred in the everyday. Peace.